Now, I want to begin with putting us in the context. So scientific collaboration and knowledge diffusion are our primary areas of interest. And what traditionally has been done in bibliometrics and a lot of scholarly communication literature is to measure this by publication metadata. These connections are often captured, but they only really capture what happens after the scientific process has been completed. Now, a lot of this publication metadata for scientific collaboration and its measurement has been captured by the publication metadata that include various fields, as you can see here. We have our title, providing very rich context about the subject, perhaps, of that scientific inquiry, as well as our names and affiliations and where it was submitted. Bibliometricians have done a great job of pulling this information to understand how scientists are working together and also how knowledge can diffuse within a particular discipline, but also outside of that discipline. There are uses for this metadata from publications that can measure the network properties, and these will correspond to effective scientific collaborations as well as measures of other important things that can tell us what are the social processes in science. Importantly, the metrics and the operationalization of some of these concepts can be a bit tricky, and so bibliometricians have approached this with various network measures. And so, in particular, for research collaboration networks, these co-authorship networks are usually the way that we operationalize this. We say, if you have published together on a paper, then you are co-authors, and we can effectively say that you collaborate. Now, while there are some issues with this approach, of course, there are many advantages as well to using this kind of network analysis. And importantly, we know a lot. We know a lot about publications. And so what we know from that publication metadata in terms of scientific collaboration include that they have smaller world properties. And so you can see in this particular graph, there are clusters, and you can see that there are scientists who are working together in rather bounded communities that have their own clusters, but also it is easily reachable from cluster to cluster. You know, you've heard of, you know, seven degrees removed from a particular person. You can send a letter and it goes 7 degrees, and that's the distance. So that's a close small world phenomenon. The second is the clustering tendencies. Similar to the small world properties, we also get these clustering tendencies, and this network visualization that you see right here is actually an example of that. Well, you'll see the clusters in blue, where you have scientists who are densely, closely connected. And this is a property that's very distinctive of particular types of collaboration networks. We see this in genetics and genomics. We see this across engineering sciences, computer sciences. There are differences between disciplines, but this clustering tendency, the tendency to work together tends to be a very consistent property in network analyses of collaboration. And finally, we have this visualization of the power law distribution. And it's a little bit difficult maybe to interpret, but basically it's just saying that you have a number of connections as a scientist. We'll say you have 5 connections, and these are the degrees. So each degree is a way of kind of measuring how well connected you are. And there's a power law degree of distribution in many scientific networks. And this one in particular shows the data that we have pulled from our analysis in the scientific collaboration network. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, our focus right here is knowledge diffusion. And we carefully conceptualize this as an outcome of scientific collaboration. Now, often knowledge diffusion is understood in innovation communities to be diffusion of innovation. And here we are trying to understand it as a social phenomenon that's really driven by those social ties, those connections you have to your colleagues, as well as with outside the group of immediate scientific collaborators. And it can be impacted by a certain person's individual characteristics, as well as the network structure around them. Now, a major development in scientific collaboration has been cyber infrastructure enabled collaboration. And so we have this example here of the National Center for Bioinformatics Research in GenBank. which is this large open research repository in which scientists are depositing their data and have been doing so since about 1982. Now, what we found in our previous studies of CI-enabled collaboration is that scientists are emerging a certain community around these cyber infrastructure-enabled structures and databases. And so to pursue this research a little further, like I mentioned in the beginning, publication metadata is often used as the primary data source to understand scientific collaboration and knowledge diffusion. And we think, and we have actually found in previous research, that the data sets, the collaboration metadata on those data sets can provide another source of insight, because you not only get the outputs of the science, kind of the tip of the iceberg, but you also get a sense of what are those collaboration networks that are the predecessors of the production of a publication. And so we say that metadata in these open data repositories does help us to understand the whole collaborative research cycle. So our main problem here is how data production affects and contributes to knowledge diffusion. We have 4 research questions, and these are all operationalized, and they have their accompanying hypotheses, which I will take you through shortly. But this first one, actually the first 2 are really interested in knowledge diffusion as predicted by our data production. So our first research question: how is data production related to knowledge diffusion? And what we thought is that actually the number of data submission is related to the number of patent applications. Our second research question is, what variables among that early stage of research collaboration can help predict the number of patents that are output? And so the way that we operationalized this was to say that the team size of the data submission networks is positively related to the number of patent applications for a particular year. This is a kind of capacity that's developed within the data producers and sort of the early stages of science to produce those publications on the other end for patents in this case. Our third research question is how the publication network is related to knowledge diffusion as measured by patents. Now, you should understand that this is actually a control. There's a little bit of a control here because we wanted to see if we take those traditional metadata, how is that then comparing to this novel source of data, which is the data production collaboration networks. And we'll get a little bit deeper into those hypotheses within a statistical analysis that I'll present in a moment. And finally, research question 4 focuses on the variables in that publication network that predict knowledge diffusion, also measured by patents. So a big takeaway of this is what we did is we said knowledge diffusion represented by patents. So that's going to be our dependent variable in this longitudinal statistical analysis. So just keep that in mind. So what we did, as I alluded to earlier, is that we took the GenBank metadata records and we extracted them from the GenBank metadata database. And then there was an author disambiguation issue, so we had to disambiguate the author data. And we also used a linear regression to test these hypotheses. Now, as I mentioned before, there are new sources of data that we can find and we can use for bibliometrics. Here's an example from GenBank, which is the NCBI repository, and it includes key pieces of metadata that are really interesting for studying scientific collaboration and diffusion, including our author names, the title, the genome sequence, as well as the date that it is submitted, and associated publications, which is an important connection. Now I'm going to take us right through our statistical properties and some of those hypothesis tests. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of a grounding in what we found as overall trends, and then I'm going to take you through the hypothesis test. So to begin, we have our statistical properties of the overarching trends and distributions of the number of patents, submissions, and publications. Now, if you'll notice, if you direct your attention to this blue line, we have data submissions. And from the early years, which is about 1982 or so, And we actually have a subset of that from 1992 to 2018 here, that you have your submissions steadily rising. And we hit a certain point right around 1994 where you can see a turning point, a fulcrum at which the data submissions actually bypass and surpass the publications. And patents are also steadily on the rise here. We also found some of the mean degrees for the data submission, publication, and patent networks. And so mean degree, again, is within that power law distribution, how many connections do you have to other people? And so here we can see that the mean degree, it fluctuates, especially within publications, but with submissions, data submissions, and the patents, it's pretty consistent. And on the contrary, we can see that, oh, the clustering coefficient for the various networks. Now, clustering coefficient can really tell us a lot about how the network is organized. And that's why we chose the clustering coefficient to represent some more of the network structural features that are a little bit more nuanced. And here we can see that the clustering coefficients are actually descending. So this was a fascinating bit of just descriptive information, because once you have a descending clustering coefficient, that tells you the network is a bit more spread out and perhaps not as hierarchical. So these lower levels actually come into play, and we wanted to see how that relates to patent production, especially in the relationship between the data collaboration and the publication network. So right into the findings here. So we had some hypotheses tests, and these are our findings. So for the first model, we were trying to understand what the submission, the patent outcomes are based on submission count, based on the team size on the average, and the mean degree. Now, these three in particular were significant, statistically significant after an OLS. We did some transformations as well, log-log transformations, and we found that these particular weights were a good description and accounted for 95% of the variation in patent production. So we have subcount, which is our data submissions. You'll see that on the left under the coefficient box. And we have the submission, team size mean. How big is that data collaboration? How many people are you working with? And the mean team size, which is also a way of just quantifying how much we have connections to other people. Now, our second hypothesis test also had a fascinating outcome. We examined just the relationship between the publication research and the knowledge diffusion that is represented by those number of patents. And so what we found was that actually pub count, just if you have a lot of articles, right? If you're in the genetics community, you have a lot of articles, you're not likely actually as much as team size might be to contribute to the value of the output of those patents. So these findings in particular were intriguing to us because they have not only empirical implications, but also some conceptual implications. And the main things that we found was that, indeed, again reinforced, if you look at some of the metadata at a large scale, just in a broad sense, to see if the data set collaborations that scientists are doing actually contributes better knowledge to the whole research cycle. And what we found is that the richness of the data submission network was really evidenced in hypothesis one. Hypothesis one, again, told us that data submissions were predictive at 95% of the patents that outcame of that particular data intensive research. So it's interesting to know that people that are collaborating on data sets, it turns out that that can actually be a fuel, like an unseen fuel that has these outputs of publications and also patents. And we saw that this, in comparison to hypothesis 2 and model 2, this is a better predictor than some of just the publication metadata and just information about who works together on publications. And so we have these two layers of science that are going on, and for so long the bottom layer was missing. And now that we have this metadata from the data repositories, we can get a better sense of actually how those collaborative connections and partnerships are resulting in knowledge diffusion as measured by patents. Now, these two other bits that I want to really point out is the clustering coefficient was an important measure because it raises the question. As I mentioned, there are less hierarchical relationships. As you could see, those decreasing trends over time. Now, what does this mean? This means that there's a flattening of the network. And this means there are potentially less hierarchically organized laboratories within collaborative science, especially data-intensive science. Now, second, we also saw a significant and a positive relationship between the data submission network and the patent counts, as I mentioned earlier. And so we're thinking that when we're thinking about knowledge diffusion, it's really important to, underscore how important those network structures are. But I want to emphasize as well that this particular study, as well as others that it's building on, have not found, are still working to provide a basis to compare data collaboration networks to publication networks, because they really display different properties. And those properties have social implications. They have implications for knowledge diffusion as well. So with that, I am excited again to present this to you. I wish I could be there in person, and I'm really excited to answer questions, to address questions, and any kind of related work that you're doing. So I would also like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation for these 2 awards, and again, my co-authors, Jen Chin and Dr. Jeff Hemsley. Both of them have been incredible collaborators, and I really appreciate it. So looking forward to your questions. Thank you.